I am a professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine, the president of the Trauma Research Foundation, and the author of many scientific articles, but most of all of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. You know, what's interesting is that trauma has always been part of humanity. Every history talks about people doing horrendous things to each other and people having a hard time getting along with each other. Every culture that I've ever known about, people have been killing each other, people have very nasty relationships with each other, aside from all the glorious things that we do. So it's interesting that trauma suddenly became into focus in America at a certain point of time. I think what happened, at some point society became safe enough and predictable enough that people started to pay attention to the fact that trauma is not a necessary part of everybody's life. And then we woke up. Historically, it's interesting, it happened at the time of the Vietnam War. And there was a bunch of young people, including myself, who were working with Vietnam veterans who at that point were our age. And we saw something that somehow people hadn't taught us about. We saw that people who came back from Vietnam were really out of control. And what's also interesting is that the main thing they told us about is, I need help, because I've become a monster. I blow up, I become very angry, I assault people, I cannot control myself, I have kids and I blow up at them for the slightest reason, and so I should be locked up or kept safe, and clearly these were people out of control. And so it was striking to us that here were guys who were used to be in very good control of themselves, who had lost control. The next thing that happened is we needed to say this was because of the war, and so we organized this PTSD diagnosis, this trauma diagnosis, according to the memory of the war. Namely, in order to convince people that this is related to the war, we had to say this is related to memories about killing people being killed, seeing horrendous stuff. So we opened up the definition of PTSD with the memory of something terrible that has happened. What's important is that that is not the main complaint that people came with most of the time. People came with the complaint of, I am out of control and I have a hard time engaging with the people in my life. But because of political reasons, we made it into a memory diagnosis of people being haunted by flashbacks and nightmares about the past, which are part of the problem, but they're only, I wouldn't say secondary, but they're one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is being unable to engage with your environment. And the subsequent development of the trauma field has not paid attention to the second part, I think, at people's peril. So it started off with these memories about Vietnam. Now, and over time we got to read old stuff. It turns out that people have been writing about trauma for a very long time, and that people have always talked about trauma as an extraordinary thing that really messes up your mind, your brain, and your body. The most important thing of which is that trauma is a horrendous experience. It's not like something that's sort of unpleasant or difficult or stressful. It is that you go, oh my God, and you feel completely helpless and you feel overwhelmed. At this point, as our research showed, the mind basically goes blank and large part of the brain stop functioning. So it's an overwhelming experience that overwhelms the person, which really makes it very hard for people to remember clearly what happened. People remember their feelings, how terrified they were, or how they didn't feel anything, which sometimes happens after trauma. Sometimes people remember a little piece, an image, a sound, a smell, the horror, but there is no story. And that's an important thing that people for a long time have talked about, and that most people these days who talk about trauma don't really acknowledge, is that the fact that the event was too horrendous to put into words. And it's only poets who can put it into words. The other thing that's interesting about the history of trauma is that it became acknowledged in the context of soldiers, which is a very strange phenomenon, because soldiers are just one group of people who get traumatized. Children of abusive parents have been traumatized forever. Women and men get traumatized in relationships. About a third of all relationships entail some violence between the partners, sometimes a lot of violence between the partners. So trauma is very common throughout society. When we first started to talk about trauma, it was defined as an event outside of normal human experience. And then we started to look at it, we realized that it happens all the time and it's very common everywhere. So there was something about us that didn't want to acknowledge the horrendous stuff that many people experience, including probably many of us who are here today have had terrible events happen to us. The issue then is that nobody really wants to remember. You want to go on with your life, you don't want to get stuck there, and you say to yourself, I have to be strong, I have to be tough, I'm going to go on with my life. Don't be filled with self-pity about what happened to you. And people around you, right after something terrible happens, feel sorry for you for a little while. The more public the trauma, the more response you get. A car accident, a natural disaster, help keeps pouring in. If you get raped by a relative, if you get molested by your own parents, nobody pays attention to you. It becomes a shameful thing and nobody wants to know about it, and you're supposed to push it away. So that's part of the trauma, is not being seen, not being known, not being acknowledged what happens to you. But fundamentally, nobody wants to acknowledge how traumatic things are. If we really knew how traumatic things are, all wars would stop. If we really fully acknowledge the reality of what happens to men and women at war. If we really acknowledge how horrendous it is, domestic violence would probably stop also. But it's interesting how psychiatry, psychology, and oftentimes politics also, does not really want to know about trauma. And so when we talk about trauma, we tend to talk about those people out there, Genghis Khan, and people who have a different race and religion than we have, as being traumatizing people. But in fact, the trauma begins at home, begins right with the people you know, and it doesn't happen from the outside, it usually happens from inside. So that's the beginning. So then we started to look at what does trauma do to people, and that takes a while to really understand. Mainly what you see in the emergency rooms, in offices, is people who are very upset. People get very triggered, people get very angry, people get very anxious, frightened, terrified, and they get triggered. So their whole body gets hyper-aroused. And a very large part of being traumatized is you get stuck in the fight-flight response. And your body gets triggered to start running or fighting back, and part of trauma is that that response doesn't stop, and your body keeps responding to its environment as if you continue to be in danger. So a very big part of trauma is that your body doesn't know that it's over, and a very important part of trauma healing is to really get deeply in touch with the fact that that was then and this is now. And how do you help the mind and the brain and the body to make a distinction between past and present? And that distinction gets really messed up when you get traumatized. It took a long time to really get to see that and to get the scientific evidence for these issues also. And that's really what we have been doing over the past 30 years, is to build up knowledge and scientific evidence for what underlies trauma. What's also important, it's a very young field. With our modern technology, we have only studied it for 30 years. And so the conclusion that we have right now, in about the year 2020, is the conclusions that are temporary, and maybe 10 years from now we may have a very different take on things.